The night my friend set me up with Mara, I realized silence can be the loudest test of who you are. He gave me a reservation and a wink, like it was a joke I didn't know the punchline for. When she pointed to her ear and then the menu, her careful smile asking if I'd flinch, I felt the whole room hold its breath. So I lifted my hands and signed, and what happened next made a stranger at the bar cry. My mother lost her hearing when I was 12. I watched her world shrink as people stopped trying, treated her like she was invisible. I promised myself I'd never let anyone feel that silence. So when my friend set me up with a deaf woman as a joke, I didn't get angry. I got ready. I need to tell you about my mother first, because without her I would have failed that night completely. Her name was Diane, and when I was 12, an illness stole her hearing in less than a week. One Friday she was singing in the kitchen, and by the following Thursday she couldn't hear the phone ring. I watched her world shrink in real time. Friends stopped calling because phone conversations required work. Waiters addressed me instead of her, as if deafness were contagious. At parent-teacher conferences, administrators asked me to translate directly from her, then talked about her in third person while she sat right there. I learned young that silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the absence of effort. So I learned to sign. Not just the alphabet or basic phrases, I became fluent. By 16, I was interpreting at her medical appointments because hospitals couldn't be bothered to provide one. By 20, I'd seen enough to know the world doesn't build ramps for the deaf the way it does for wheelchairs. It builds walls and calls them your problem. My mother never complained. She just navigated a world that treated her communication as an inconvenience. And I made a promise to myself, not to her, because she would have hated the pity. I promised I would never be the person who made someone feel invisible for something they couldn't control. Fast forward to last year. I was 34, single, and my friend Jake had appointed himself my dating coach without my consent. He was the kind of guy who viewed bachelorhood as a disease and himself as the cure. He'd send me profiles without asking, manufacture accidental meetings at parties, and treat every failed connection as a personal affront. When he handed me a reservation card for a Friday night dinner at a place called Vincenzo's and said, "Just trust me, this one's special," I should have asked more questions. But he'd been pestering me for months, and I figured one dinner couldn't hurt. He didn't tell me her name. He didn't tell me anything except the time, the table, and that she'd be wearing a blue dress. Then he winked, that same wink I'd later come to recognize as the look of a man who thought he'd orchestrated something clever. Vincenzo's was one of those dimly lit downtown restaurants where tables are close enough to share secrets by accident. Candlelight flickered across white tablecloths, and the murmur of couples and parties filled the space with an intimate hum. I arrived a few minutes early and spotted Jake near the front, half hidden behind a decorative partition, pretending to read the wine list. He didn't think I'd seen him. Then I saw her. She was seated at our table, a small notebook open beside her plate, her eyes scanning the room with a guardedness that felt familiar. When she noticed me approaching, she smiled carefully, the kind of smile that's been disappointed before. She pointed to her ear, then to the menu, and I understood instantly. She was deaf. Jake hadn't told me, and then I looked around. The couple at the next table had stopped talking. A server near the bar stood motionless. Behind the partition, Jake was watching with the intensity of someone betting on a horse race. They all expected something from this moment: awkwardness, retreat, maybe a polite escape. I felt the weight of every pair of eyes pressing down, holding a silence that was not the same as Mara's. It was the silence of an audience waiting for a performance. I took a breath. Then slowly I raised my hands and signed. "I'm sorry he didn't tell me. I hope you're still willing to stay." Her hands froze mid-gesture. Her face shifted through surprise, confusion, and something I couldn't read. For one terrible second I thought I'd overstepped. But then she signed back, "You sign." Her hands were trembling slightly, but her eyes had gone wide in a way that cut through every defense I'd built. I nodded and signed again, slower this time, making sure every word landed. I told her my mother lost her hearing when I was 12, that I'd watched her become invisible to strangers, one forgotten conversation at a time, that I'd promised myself I would never be the person who let someone sit in silence while the world turned away. Mara's face crumpled, but she didn't look down. She held my gaze as tears slipped past her lashes, soundless and unashamed. She signed that she'd been on dates where men walked out the moment they realized she couldn't hear. Dates where servers rolled their eyes when she pointed instead of speaking. Dates where friends had set her up as a novelty, a test of character, a story to tell later. She walked into this restaurant already braced for humiliation. Then she looked at me and signed. "You're the first person who didn't look at me like I was a problem to solve." I felt something crack open in my chest. I signed that I was nervous, that I'd been a coward for not asking more questions before arriving, that the moment I saw her I knew she deserved effort, not pity. I told her she was beautiful, not despite the silence she lived in, but because of the strength it took to walk into a room full of hearing strangers and trust that someone might actually try. Her hand flew to her mouth. A small sob escaped, the kind that makes no sound but carries more weight than any scream. The restaurant had gone completely still, not the quiet of an awkward pause, but the deep, reverent hush that falls when people witness something private and sacred by accident. The couple at the next table had forgotten their meals. A waiter stood frozen mid-step, a water pitcher tilting unnoticed in his hand. At the bar, a woman in a red dress had tears streaming openly down her face. And behind the partition, Jake, my friend, the architect of this entire night, stood with his hand clamped over his mouth, eyes glistening, watching the joke he'd planned turn into something he didn't have the vocabulary to understand. I kept signing, not for the audience, but because for the first time in years, I was talking about my mother without grief strangling the words. I told Mara how Mom used to tap rhythms on the kitchen counter so I could feel the vibrations while she cooked. How she taught me that listening wasn't about ears, it was about attention. How I still caught myself signing along to songs on the radio even though there was no one left to translate for. Mara reached across the table and took my hands, pressing them gently to stop me. She signed, "She's still with you. I can feel her in every word you just gave me." That was the moment the entire restaurant seemed to exhale. Someone at a corner table started clapping, then stopped, unsure if applause was appropriate. But it wasn't a performance. It was two people meeting across an impossible distance and finding solid ground. Mara's tears had soaked the edge of her napkin, but her smile was the steadiest thing I'd ever seen. She signed, "Ask me the question you've been too scared to ask." I hesitated. Then I signed, "Why did you say yes to this setup? You must have known he didn't tell me about you." She laughed silently, a shake of her shoulders. She signed that Jake had messaged her through a mutual friend, saying he knew a decent guy who wouldn't care that she was deaf. She'd assumed wouldn't care meant he'd informed me. When she realized he hadn't, she decided to stay anyway, not out of hope but out of exhaustion. She was tired of running from rooms that weren't ready for her. She wanted to see if I'd prove her cynicism right or wrong. "And," I signed, "you made everyone in this restaurant cry," she signed back. "I think you exceeded expectations." But here's what I didn't know yet, what no one at that table could have possibly realized. The real test hadn't even started. Because as I sat there holding Mara's hand in a silence that felt fuller than any conversation I'd ever had, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it. Then it buzzed again, and again. Finally, I glanced down, and what I saw on the screen made my blood run cold. It was a message from Jake. 5 words. "Don't read the comments, man." Confusion hit first. What comments? Then I realized. During the entire dinner, during every signed word, every tear, every silent moment, my phone had been buzzing with notifications from a platform I barely used. Jake had been live streaming the whole thing. I looked up. He was still behind that partition, but now his phone was pointed directly at our table, and the screen was glowing with a chat feed scrolling faster than I could process. Mara must have seen the change in my face. She signed, "What's wrong?" I couldn't lie to her, not after what we just shared. So I turned the phone toward her and I signed, "He's been broadcasting this the entire evening. There are people watching us right now." Her body went rigid. The vulnerable woman who had just let down every guard was replaced by someone older, harder, forged in fires I couldn't see. She didn't cry. She didn't look around in panic. She picked up her notebook and wrote 2 words that I will never forget: "Show me." I handed her the phone. She scrolled through the comments. I watched her face. The chat was a sewer. Some people were moved, calling it beautiful, heartwarming, faith in humanity restored. But just as many were cruel. They debated whether she was faking her deafness for sympathy. They mocked the restaurant patrons for crying. They made jokes about sign language, about her appearance, about my performance. And there, pinned at the top of the stream by Jake himself, was the caption, "Blind date with a deaf girl, will he walk out? Watch his reaction." That was the real punchline, not the setup itself, but the framing. Jake hadn't just failed to tell me she was deaf, he'd advertised her deafness as the spectacle. He'd written a title designed to bait viewers into expecting rejection. The whole night, the whole beautiful, sacred connection, had been content. And every person who'd cried at those tables had been an unpaid extra. I stood up so fast my chair scraped the floor. The noise broke the hush. Heads turned. I walked toward the partition where Jake was standing, his phone still raised, his eyes wide with fear he hadn't planned for. I didn't yell. I didn't shove him. I leaned in close and whispered, "In the stream. Now." He stammered something about not knowing it would get this big, about how he just thought it would be a fun video, how he never expected us to actually connect. I repeated, "End it." His thumb fumbled across the screen and the red recording light blinked off. The chat froze. The audience, scattered across who knows how many screens, went dark. But the damage was not contained to one dinner. In the 35 minutes he'd been live, the stream had been picked up by reaction channels, clipped and shared, viewed over 200,000 times and climbing. Our most vulnerable moment was already property of the internet. I turned back toward our table. Mara was standing now, holding her purse, her face unreadable. She signed, "I've been used this way before. I thought this time would be different." Then she started walking toward the exit. Not toward Jake, not toward me, just away. And the worst part was that she didn't look angry, she looked tired. The same tired my mother wore every time a doctor talked over her head. But then something happened. The woman at the bar, the one who'd been crying earlier, stepped into Mara's path. She was older, maybe late 50s, with silver hair and the kind of dignity that doesn't need to announce itself. She raised her hands and signed, "I'm sorry that man did this to you, but what you shared was real. I saw it. We all saw it." Then the waiter who'd been motionless earlier set down his pitcher and signed, "I've served 1,000 first dates. Never seen anything like that." Then another customer, a young man at a corner table, stood up and signed haltingly, "You are not a show. You are a person." I learned later that all three of them were connected to the local deaf community. The woman at the bar was a retired interpreter. The waiter had a deaf sister. The young man had been learning sign after falling in love with a deaf classmate. They hadn't intervened before because they'd been moved by the same thing everyone else had been moved by, the sense that this was private territory. But now, seeing the betrayal, they showed up. Mara froze. She looked from one signing stranger to another, and for the first time since she'd seen the stream, her composure cracked. She covered her mouth, shoulders shaking. The interpreter woman took her hand and guided her back toward the table, not to sit for Jake's benefit, but to take a moment. I walked back over, but I didn't sit. I stood at a distance, letting her decide. Jake had slunk away from the partition, his phone dangling dead at his side, his face a ruin of guilt. He tried to approach, and one of the other diners, the man who'd been sitting with his wife, blocked him with a quiet hand on his chest. "I think you've done enough." The next few minutes were a blur of small kindnesses. Someone brought Mara a glass of water. The interpreter woman asked her if she wanted to leave, wanted police, wanted to press charges for unlawful filming. Mara shook her head. She signed, "I just want to know why." And then she looked directly at me. Not Jake, me. She signed, "Did you know?" This was the abyss. I could have said no and it would have been true. But I could also have said that I'd suspected Jake was up to something. That I'd walked in and seen the wink, the hidden position, the phone. I'd known an audience was present. I'd even played to it, consciously or not, by signing in full view. Had I been a co-creator of the spectacle, I signed back. I didn't know about the stream, but I knew people were watching and I didn't stop performing. I don't know if that makes me complicit. Mara studied me for a long time. The whole restaurant was silent again, but this time it was the silence of a held breath. She signed, "I came here expecting a joke. I stayed because you felt real. I don't need you to be perfect. I need you to be honest." And then she did something that changed everything. She reached into her bag slowly, deliberately, and pulled out her own phone. The screen glowed with a recording app, the timer showing it had been running since the moment she sat down. Then she slid the phone across the table and signed, "I've been burned before. I record every first date now, just in case. I needed to know if you were real." I stared at the screen, at the minutes and seconds ticking upward, capturing everything. My signing, her tears, the confession about my mother, the entire room gasping. She had walked in with the same fear I had, that people were watching, that this might be a trap. But while I'd worried about a dinner party's judgment, she'd been worried about being turned into content. She'd been right. I looked up at her. "You thought I might be in on it," I signed. She nodded, eyes wet again but chin lifted. "I wanted to believe you weren't. And when you signed about your mother, I knew the stream couldn't be your fault. You couldn't fake that kind of pain, but I still needed proof that I wasn't the only one being watched." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was like the moment after a storm when you realize the roof held. I reached across the table and took both her hands, the same hands that had just laid bare her deepest self-protection. "I'm sorry you had to do that," I signed. "But I'm not sorry you had evidence. We both walked into a trap and we both found something else. I don't want to lose it because of him." Mara's expression shifted. She pulled one hand free, not to pull away but to wipe her eyes with her sleeve. Then she signed, "I still want to know you. Not on camera, not for a viral video. Just you in a quiet place where no one is watching." I looked around the restaurant. The other diners, the interpreter, the waiter, they were all still there, not as an audience now, but as a protective ring. I turned back to Mara, stood up and held out my hand. She took it. We walked toward the door together. Jake was still by the partition, looking as small as I've ever seen a grown man look. He opened his mouth, but I held up my hand, palm flat, the universal stop, not in anger, in finality. Then I signed so only Mara could see, "He doesn't get another word from us." She nodded once and we stepped out into the cool night air. The story should have ended there. A beautiful connection born from a cruel stunt, a quiet exit, a private future. But the internet doesn't care about endings. By the time we reached the sidewalk, the stream had already been ripped, clipped, and reposted across 4 platforms. When I woke up the next morning, the footage had been viewed over 2 million times. Comment sections became war zones. People debated whether I was a hero or a performer. They analyzed Mara's facial expressions like sports replays. They accused her of emotional manipulation and me of savior complex. The cruelty was industrial, but something else happened too. Among the noise, a different thread started growing. Comments from deaf people, from children of deaf parents, from interpreters and teachers. They weren't reacting to the drama, they were reacting to the signing. To seeing two people communicate in their language on a massive platform without subtitles or pity. Mara's phone recording, which she later released with our permission to counteract Jake's narrative, showed the raw, unedited truth. A man who had learned to sign because his mother was erased, and a woman who refused to be erased again. The retired interpreter from the restaurant, a woman named Gloria, contacted us. She said she'd spent 40 years bridging worlds and she'd never seen a single dinner change so many minds. She offered to help us shape a public statement. We declined the spotlight but accepted her friendship. She became a quiet mentor, and over coffee 3 days later she told me something that reframed everything. "Your mother didn't just teach you signs. She taught you that love requires effort. You showed up with effort. That's all Mara ever needed." My first real date with Mara, the one without Jake, without hidden phones, without a restaurant full of witnesses, happened on a Sunday afternoon. We met at a bookstore. She had asked where I felt most myself, and I'd named the old downtown shop with uneven floors and a poetry section that smelled like vanilla. She arrived in a green dress, hair loose, a small sketchbook under her arm. I had coffee waiting. She signed, "You remembered that I draw." I signed back, "You remembered that I'm not boring." She laughed, and the sound of it, half silent but full-bodied, filled the space more than any noise could. We spent 3 hours in that bookstore. She drew tiny frogs in the margins of a discounted art history book, a callback to her student days. I read her a poem that I'd been too scared to share on that first night. She listened with her eyes, the way my mother used to, watching my lips and my hands and the shape of my breath. When we left, she took my arm, not for balance but for closeness. Something had settled between us, something durable. It took weeks for the full truth to surface. One evening, while we were cooking dinner at her apartment, she insisted on measuring spices by smell because recipes were too formal. She paused. She set down a jar of paprika and turned to me with a look I hadn't seen before. Then she signed the words that really changed everything. "I need to tell you something. I wasn't just set up by Jake. I asked for you." I froze. She explained. Months earlier, she told a mutual friend she wanted to meet a hearing man who knew sign language. Not as a novelty, but because she'd grown tired of men who saw her deafness as a burden before a single word was signed. The friend mentioned Jake, who bragged about having a friend whose mother was deaf and who signed fluently. Jake reached out, promised he could arrange a meeting, then twisted it into content. Mara hadn't known about the stream, hadn't known how he'd frame it. But she had walked into that restaurant not as a passive victim. She'd been looking for me. She'd chosen the setup before it became a spectacle, and when I signed across the table, she knew her gamble had paid off. I didn't feel manipulated. I felt seen. For 34 years, my signing had been a private language of loss and duty. That night, it became the language of recognition. She hadn't been testing my character. She'd been hoping her search was over, and I, without knowing it, had been searching too. Gloria later said, "You two met in the eye of a hurricane. Most people run from that wind. You built a house in it." 6 months later, Mara introduced me to her father, a gentle man who cried when I signed a promise to never turn her existence into a performance. I introduced her to my mother, Diane, who watched Mara's hands dance and then signed. "He talks too much, doesn't he?" Mara laughed so hard she nearly spilled her tea. My mother had just met her match. Jake never fully recovered from that night. He lost most of his friends not because we demanded it, but because people finally saw the difference between a joke and a betrayal. He sent a long apology letter. I read it once, then put it in a drawer. Not erased, not forgiven, just filed. Some debts can't be collected. The final surprising detail came last year on the 1-year anniversary of that dinner. Mara handed me a small box. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, hand-stitched, filled with sketches of every significant moment since we'd met. The restaurant table, my hands mid-sign, the bookstore poetry section, the paprika jar, my mother's teapot. On the last page, she'd written in careful penmanship, "You said you were a coward for not asking questions, but you asked the most important one with your hands. Are you still willing?" I was. I still am. That notebook is on our shelf now, beside the ones we still fill together. Not as proof of anything, just as a record of a silence that speaks. I think about that night a lot, not because of the viral video or the restaurant full of strangers crying, but because of the question it forced me to confront. How often do we treat other people as tests of our own character instead of as actual human beings? Jake set us up to see if I'd flinch, and the internet watched to judge what kind of man I was.